would say the most popular question that I get whenever I teach a course on the arms trade is how has the arms trade changed since, say, the 1950s or since the end of World War II? And the primary thing that I always like to point out is the absolute boom in the number of arms suppliers around the globe. In 1950, we had around 50, and then today we have around 80 states that are actively participating in the arms trade by exporting arms. If you don't believe me, let's go ahead and check out the numbers. This data is taken from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which keeps track of the number of states that trade arms in any given year. And as you can see here, we've seen a dramatic rise in the number of states actively exporting arms around the globe. Again, we're operating with less than 40 in the period of 1950 to 1959 to all the way around 80 to 83 within the past 10 years. That's a massive change. But how does that change then affect the arms transfer system itself? Well, Chris Rock makes a great point.
Man is basically as faithful as his options.
Now, although Chris Rock wasn't talking directly about states in that particular clip, the point still stands. The increase in the number of suppliers around the globe deeply affects the arms transfer system itself and the dynamics within it. States now don't have to choose between just Russian goods or US goods as they usually did in the early parts of the Cold War. Now they can choose between Brazilian goods or Italian goods or French goods or Chinese goods. The point is they have a number of different choices. And states are beginning to understand that increasing their number of choices or diversifying their supply also frees up their ability to determine their own foreign and domestic policy. Retired Egyptian army officer Ahmed Abdul Halim was quoted as saying, "The diversification of the supply of weapons and technologies is aimed at dissuading any country from exercising a monopoly over Egypt or of trying to blackmail it." The point is that states have understood during the Cold War that both superpowers, both the US and Russia, used arms as a tool of foreign policy to coerce the importing state into adopting domestic and foreign policies that were friendly to the exporting state. States have learned from that and they've begun to actively diversify. But by how much? Let's again look at the numbers. Again, using data from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, we can see that the number of suppliers that any one state imports arms from has increased over time. During the 1950s, the average number of importers that any one state would import from was 0.5. Now that may not make sense, but remember, this takes into account every country in the entire world in any given year. Most countries don't import arms, so it tends to lower the average. But then we look at the overall trend here. So we go from 0.5 in 1950, then we look at 2010, where the average number of states that any one state was importing arms from jumped up to damn near 3. That's a 373% increase in system diversification. Still don't quite get it? Let's look at individual countries. If we take a look at the average number of suppliers that Egypt had during two different periods of time, we see a massive change. Egypt was only importing from 5 different suppliers in the period between 1960 and 1965. Jump to 2015 to 2020, we see the number of different states that Egypt is importing arms from jumps from 5 all the way up to 13. And to nail the point home even more, we can take a look at Saudi Arabia and the average number of importers that Saudi Arabia was importing from during those same 2 time periods. In the time period between 1960 and 1965, Saudi Arabia was only importing from 2 different suppliers. Jump to 2015 to 2020, and they're importing from 23. That's a massive, massive change and a massive increase in arms import diversification. Staying with the example of Saudi Arabia, who initially primarily imported arms from states like the US, they've begun to diversify the number of states that they import arms from. So they can import arms from Brazil, or planes from France, or tanks from China, or guns from Russia, or missile systems from South Korea, or trucks from the Czech Republic. You get my point here. States are beginning to diversify, and that's having an effect on the utility of using arms transfers as a tool of leverage. Now, I know you're probably wondering to yourself right now, why does this diversification even matter? Well, it matters when we look at how arms transfers have been used in the past 70 years since the end of World War II. And arms transfers have essentially been foreign policy writ large. Large states such as China, Russia, and the US have traditionally used arms transfers as a tool of coercion in foreign policy. If I decide to send you arms, then I'm also going to want something in return. And often that means protecting the exporting state's interests. The overt use of arms transfers as a means of coercion can be seen in the 1967 Six-Day War, when the US and Russia embargoed every state within the conflict to bring all sides to the bargaining table. And today, we still see the US attempt to use arms transfers as a tool of foreign policy coercion, especially when it comes to human rights abuses by governments in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Curtailing US arms transfers to client states has consistently been considered a productive tool in America's foreign policy toolbox. But the increase in diversification has changed that to a large degree. The increase in diversification decreases leverage, which also increases a state's political independence. Does that mean that arms transfers aren't a useful tool of foreign policy? No, it doesn't mean that at all. Arms transfers are still an incredibly effective and useful tool in America's foreign policy toolbox. The difference is with diversification, it's more useful as a carrot rather than a stick. And that's why I think that the rise in the amount of arms suppliers over the past 70 years is the biggest, most important change when we look at the arms transfer system itself.